there is one road that keeps Russia's grip on Crimea from collapsing entirely. One supply corridor, one artery. And as of the last week of May 2026, Ukrainian paratroopers are close enough to cut it. What you're about to hear isn't a headline. It's the story of how a series of silent, fog-covered night raids by a few thousand elite soldiers may have just rewritten the strategic map of Eastern Europe. And what that means for every NATO ally watching from the sidelines. To understand what happened on the southern front in late May 2026, you have to understand what Russia cannot afford to lose. Crimea isn't just a peninsula with a warm-water naval base, though the Black Sea Fleet anchored there is central to Moscow's entire southern military posture. Crimea is the symbolic crown of Vladimir Putin's war. He annexed it in 2014. He built a 12-mile bridge across the Kerch Straits at extraordinary cost to connect it to the Russian mainland. In the political mythology he has constructed, Crimea is non-negotiable. But that mythology has a physical vulnerability. The only land route feeding Russian forces in Crimea runs through a narrow corridor of southern Ukraine. Through the city of Melitopol, through Tokmak, hugging the northern coastline of the Sea of Azov. Sever that corridor, and Crimea doesn't fall in a day. But it begins to starve. Every Ukrainian advance toward the south, every village liberated, every kilometer of road brought under artillery range, tightens that noose. And in the last week of May, Ukraine's air assault forces didn't just advance. They accelerated. Here's what the competitor coverage largely missed. The territory gained isn't the story. The method is the story. For most of this war, both sides have relied on attritional warfare, mass artillery bombardment, grinding infantry advances, industrial-scale ammunition consumption. It's the warfare of the First World War dressed in satellite imagery. It is enormously costly and produces modest results. What Ukraine's air assault forces executed in the Zaporizhia-Dnipropetrovsk corridor in May 2026 was categorically different. The 95th Air Assault Brigade, one of the most studied units in NATO military circles right now, deployed what military analysts have started calling infiltration saturation doctrine. Instead of massing forces for a frontal push, they dissolved into the battlefield. Small teams of 10 to 30 soldiers, equipped with thermal optics and moving at night, used 2 full weeks of covert drone reconnaissance to map every Russian defensive node, command posts, logistics nodes, drone relay stations, artillery observer positions. They weren't looking for the front line. They were looking for the nervous system behind it. When they struck on the night of May 29th, they didn't hit the trenches first. They hit the eyes and the brain. AI-assisted targeting systems cross-referenced drone footage with electronic signal intercepts to identify high-value Russian officers with a precision that no human intelligence chain could match at that speed. The command structure didn't just get disrupted, it got decapitated. And then, with Russian unit commanders cut off from their battalions, the assault teams poured through the gaps. Now let's talk about what was waiting on the other side of those Russian lines. Because this is where the story gets genuinely tragic from a military standpoint, if you can call anything in war tragic in a clean way. The forces defending this sector weren't generic conscripts pulled from Russian prisons. The 120th Naval Infantry Division is an amphibious assault formation drawn from Russia's Baltic Fleet. These are soldiers trained for beach landings, for operating in contested maritime environments, for rapid combined arms operations. They are elite troops by Russian standards. And yet they were dug into static trenches in landlocked southern Ukraine, performing the exact function their trainings explicitly did not prepare them for. This is the signature crisis of the Russian military in 2026. Russia entered this war with a tiered force structure. Elite formations meant for high-intensity maneuver warfare, and a mass of lower-quality infantry for holding territory. 2 years of catastrophic losses have collapsed that structure. Now Russia's best-trained soldiers are being used as trench fillers because there is simply no one else. The Pacific Fleet's 40th and 55th Naval Infantry Brigades faced a similar mismatch. Units designed for amphibious operations along Russia's far eastern coast found themselves trying to hold defensive lines in a theater they never trained for against an enemy that had spent weeks misbacking their every weakness. When the Ukrainian strike came, those units had no playbook for it. Their communications went dark. Their drone operators, the eyes they depended on for early warning, were among the first targets. In the absence of coordination, Russian forces did what forces always do when command collapses. They either fled or died in place. Let's put some geography around this, because American audiences deserve to understand what a gain of 46 kilometers in this specific location actually means, not just as an abstract number, but as a lever on the entire war. The Zaporizhzhia Oblast and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast share a border that runs roughly east to west across southern Ukraine for most of 2024 and early 2025. That border sat inside Russian-occupied territory. Ukraine's sustained offensive pressure through the spring of 2026 has pushed the front line southward, liberating communities that had lived under occupations since 2022. The additional 46 kilometers cleared in the final days of May didn't just expand a map. It did three specific things. First, it brought Ukrainian long-range artillery, and more critically, Ukraine's expanding arsenal of domestically produced cruise missiles within range of the Tokmak logistics hub. Russian supply convoys moving through that area are now operating under constant threat. Commanders on the ground are reportedly routing vehicles through secondary roads at night, which slows resupply and accelerates vehicle wear. Second, the liberation of the Orikhiv-Velika-Novosilka axis severed a lateral supply route that forces used to shift reinforcements between the eastern Donetsk front and the southern Zaporizhzhia front. These two theaters can no longer easily support each other. They are, in effect, becoming separate wars. Third, and most consequentially, Ukrainian forces are now within theoretical strike range of the rail lines feeding Crimea from the north. Those rail lines are irreplaceable. The Kerch Bridge, Russia's alternate logistics artery into Crimea, has been struck multiple times by Ukrainian naval drones and is operating at reduced capacity. If the northern rail corridors come under sustained fire, Russian logistics to Crimea will face a crisis with no easy solution. Now, here's where intellectual honesty requires a pause. Ukraine's gains are real. The Russian military's structural problems are real. But anyone presenting this as a story with a predetermined outcome is selling you a narrative, not analysis. Russia still has significant advantages that haven't evaporated. It retains a massive manpower reservoir. Even if formal mobilization carries enormous political risk domestically, Russia has repeatedly found ways to coerce men into uniform through regional pressure, prison recruitments, and financial incentives that would look extraordinary in any other context. That reservoir hasn't run dry. Russia also retains a meaningful edge in one critical area: deep strike capability. Its Iskander ballistic missiles, its Shahed drone campaign, and its hypersonic Kinzhal systems give Moscow the ability to hit Ukrainian logistics, rail infrastructure, and command nodes deep inside Ukrainian territory. Ukraine's advances create longer supply lines, and longer supply lines are vulnerable. Perhaps most importantly, Russia has demonstrated a disturbing willingness to absorb losses that would have ended most other wars. Monthly casualty figures that would spark political revolutions in Western democracies have been absorbed by the Kremlin through information control and nationalist framing. That political durability, however grotesque its cost, is a genuine strategic asset. What the events of late May revealed is not that Russia is defeated. It's that Russia is losing ground in a sector it cannot afford to lose ground in, and that it currently has no operational answer for the specific combination of tactics Ukraine has deployed. For American audiences, the natural question is, why does any of this matter? The answer operates on several levels, and none of them are abstract. The most immediate is the defense industrial argument. Ukraine is now the world's largest real-time test bed for Western military technology. The Excalibur precision-guided shells, the HIMARS rocket systems, the ATACMS missiles, All of them are performing against a peer adversary in ways that no training exercise could replicate. Every after-action report from the Ukrainian military is being studied in Huntsville, Alabama, and in the Pentagon's acquisition offices. The tactical lessons from the Zaporizhzhia offensive will shape American weapons programs for the next 20 years. The second level is the precedent being set for the wider international order. This is watching this conflict with extraordinary attention, not because Beijing is aligned with Moscow in any deep sense, but because Taiwan presents an analogous set of strategic problems: a land corridor, a supply dependency, a naval component. Chinese military planners are drawing conclusions from every Ukrainian operation that successfully disrupts a supply line or degrades a superior conventional force. So are the planners in Taipei. The third level is NATO cohesion, a Ukrainian military success in the south, particularly one that threatens Crimea's logistical viability, will trigger the most serious political debate inside the alliance since the war began. Some members will argue for accelerating weapons deliveries to press the advantage. Others will counsel restraint to avoid provoking nuclear escalation. That debate will define the alliance's credibility for years. Numbers are how militaries talk about war. But war is not experienced in kilometers or casualty statistics. In the villages of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, now returning to Ukrainian control, civilians are emerging from basements they have not left in months. They are finding their houses stripped, not just by shells, but by methodical looting. Furniture, appliances, copper wiring pulled from walls. This is documented across dozens of liberated communities, a pattern of systematic economic extraction that tells you something profound about the economic desperation of the soldiers who occupied them. Russian casualty figures, somewhere in the range of 30,000 men per month by the Institute for the Study of Wars estimates, represent a scale of loss that Soviet-era military doctrine was built to absorb, but that modern Russian society, with its smaller and more media-connected population, finds increasingly difficult to process in silence. The Kremlin's information architecture is straining. Regional governors are receiving pressure from families. The quiet social contract, "we won't tell you, you won't ask," is fraying. The paratroopers executing these operations are not machines either. The 95th Brigade has been in near-continuous combat for over years. Their losses are classified, but they are real. Elite units cannot be regenerated quickly. Ukraine's operational tempo is extraordinary, and it is being sustained on borrowed time, borrowed resources, and borrowed will. Senior Ukrainian commanders have made a specific and striking claim. The next 6 to 9 months represent the critical decision window of the entire war. This is not the language of optimism. It is the language of operational planning. What they mean is this: Russia is currently rotating its elite formations out of the Donbas offensive to stabilize the collapsing southern front. That rotation degrades Russian offensive pressure in the east. It creates a strategic window, narrow, possibly brief, in which Ukraine can press its advantage in the south before Russia reconstitutes a coherent defensive line. Every week that window stays open, Ukrainian forces can move their long-range fires closer to the logistics routes feeding Crimea. Every week Russian commanders spend shuffling units between failing fronts. They are not building the layered defense in depth that could stabilize the situation. Military historians will recognize this pattern. It is the same dynamic that unraveled the German defensive position on the Western Front in late 1944. Not a single catastrophic breakthrough, but a cascading series of resource trade-offs, each one weakening a different sector, none individually decisive, all collectively terminal. Whether Ukraine can maintain the operational tempo to exploit that window depends on factors that extend well beyond the battlefield. Western weapons deliveries, domestic political will in Kyiv, Russian willingness to accept negotiation, and decisions being made right now in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing. Here is the strategic bottom line: Russia's 2026 summer offensive, the campaign designed to finally break Ukrainian resistance in Donbas and consolidate southern gains, has been operationally preempted. Not defeated, preempted. Ukraine seized the initiative before Moscow could concentrate its forces for a coordinated push. The Crimea land corridor, the single most strategically sensitive piece of terrain in this entire war, is now under genuine threat for the first time. Not hypothetical threat, operational threat. Ukrainian artillery is measurable kilometers from roads that Russian logistics cannot survive without. What Russia does next will tell us more about the war's trajectory than any battlefield event of the past year. If Moscow escalates, with mobilization, with strikes on Western logistics hubs, with nuclear signaling, the war enters its most dangerous phase. If Moscow absorbs these losses and attempts to reconstitute, it buys Ukraine time it may use to decisive effect. What Ukraine's Ghost Brigades accomplished in the fog of late May 2026 was not just the liberation of villages. It was the demonstration that a smaller, technologically sophisticated, tactically adaptive force can systematically dismantle a larger conventional army, village by village, command post by command post, supply route by supply route. That lesson will outlast this war, and its implications stretch far beyond the steppes of southern Ukraine.